let's use what we know so far to start creating those 3 or 4 pages that we need for the assignment. Okay, and we'll do that. We'll use the Java server we just created as our first foray into building the application. All right, so let's see. We have STS. We're not going to be using STS. It's a little clunky, but and anyway, we're not going to be implementing any Java just yet. We'll do HTML today, CSS, JavaScript today, and then we'll do some Java when we come back Thursday. Okay. All right. So let's see. Where are we? Our code was we put it in here, right? So Januzzi, so web app, webdev, 2005, lectures. There it is, right? So this is our server, and our web is under here, right? There's our index HTML. So I'm going to use as an IDE. I'm not going to use STS. I too don't particularly care for the Eclipse. So instead, I'll use Webstorm, which is a derivation of IntelliJ, another of JetBrains' great products. And we'll open that directory right there. So let's see, where are we? We are in webdev. We'll go down to summer 2, lectures, and we'll go to source, main, and web app. There we go. All right, and there's our index page. Okay, so here we can start creating a couple things. Let's start with the login page, the registration page, and whatnot. Okay. All right, so let's create our first file, and we'll be login. So remember, we had a naming convention, right? So login would be the feature that we're working on. Then also the role of this file, right? So this would be, it's a template. Also, where is this being executed, right? This is being run on the client side, right? On some browser is downloaded this and is interpreting it. So there it is, right? All right, so we have an HTML. It's a blank HTML page, and so let's start implementing a couple things here. So it's a login page. So let's get started with perhaps H1. This is our login page. And perhaps we'll have a label that describes that we'll like a couple things from you. We'll like maybe a username for you to type, and then maybe an input field where we can you'll type in the username, and we'll have a couple of these. We'll have same thing for label, for username, for password. Okay, and maybe a button. That would be login. All right. Okay, so let's see. We can. Is this running remotely? This is what's running remotely, right? This is the one that's running locally. We can clean install and redeploy and generate that jar file. Right, and then run the jar file again, and verify that we have our brand new login page, which is not that one. It's the local one. Where's our local one? Did I have the local ones open somewhere? I guess not. Localhost 8080. We still have our welcome, and presumably we have also now our login.template dot client dot HTML. There it is, right? So that's our login page, but it's kind of a pain having to compile again every time, right? And so another thing that we could do is that we can just run. Let's see if I can do it from STS. Let me stop this. From STS, we can use it at least as an executable. We can take out the demo application, right? And we can say run it as a Java application. So it'll run here, but the benefit is that we won't have to recompile every time, right? This will leave the server up and running, and we can just work on HTML separately, right? So let's see. All right, so it's running remotely. Well, I'm sorry, running locally, but run from STS as opposed to from the command line. Okay. So let's make a couple of changes here. One of the things that we'd like to be able to do is that it's a good practice to give unique identifiers to your input fields. So we'll say maybe this ID is username. All right. And what that allows us to do is say that this label is for the username. All right. What that allows you to do is that if you refresh, if you click on the label, notice that the input field is also selected. You see that? So you don't just have to click on the input field to make it focus, but you can also click on the label. Again, very, very convenient for on a phone, right, where you're typing, where you're clicking, right, with your fingers, to increase the area, the clickable area, as much as you can, right, to make it so that the experience as pleasurable as possible for the end user. Make sense? All right. So you should use that. We should do that for all of these, right? So ID, password, and for password. So refresh. So now if I click on password, it becomes there. Excellent. The other thing that's also very useful that increases human experience, good experience, is that to provide a placeholder. A placeholder is an example of what is it that we're asking you for, right? Or maybe if we're not using labels, we could put in the placeholder, the actual label as a placeholder, right? So here you might say, maybe some Joe, right, or John, or something common in your particular culture that might be somebody might know that, oh, this is a username, right, that you're asking for, right? I like to use Alice a lot, so I'll use Alice. So if I refresh, notice that Alice becomes the placeholder, an example of what is that we're looking for you to type in there. Okay. Same thing for the password. We might put here a placeholder and we say something gibberish, right? For an example for them to type something there, and then it goes away when you start typing, right? And then it comes back when there's nothing in it. Also for the password. But notice that the password is kind of that should not be visible, right? So a good practice is to, again, make use of these as strongly typed as you can. In particular, in passwords, we can give it the type equal password, so that if we refresh, notice that it becomes not visible. Make sense? All right. The default is that these are just plain text. That is the default. If you don't say anything, the default is text. Yes?
Have you ever seen on any web form where the placeholder, once you start typing into that box, it types like appended to the placeholder? I don't know if you know what I'm saying. The placeholder's by default in like a gray text. Have you ever had it where when you start typing, it types in gray text in addition to the placeholder? Because I know
I think you might need to do that with JavaScript. I'm not quite sure. I don't believe it's not a default behavior of the browser. Yeah, you can do all that with JavaScript. Yep. Notice that all these, and as you might know already, right? These are tags, right? Notice that this is an opening tag, right? And this is a closing tag. Notice that the input field has only an opening tag. See that? Notice that it doesn't have a closing tag. Right, so we call that a self-closing tag, right? But it has a slash at the end. See that? Right? We call that in between the opening and closing. We call that the body of the tag, right? So the label has a body, but the input doesn't have a body. See that? All right. Also, we call these attributes, all right? And these are the values of the attribute, which allow you to parameterize the behavior of the tag, right? So these are tags, meaning they're pointy brackets and whatnot, but the more general term is that these are elements. Right? So these are all elements. They happen to be rendered as pointy bracket tags. Okay? But that's only a particular a way of rendering it. You could have used your curly brackets, or we could have used a single quotes, or we could have used any other way of delimiting the content. Yes? Pointy bracket is just an arbitrary way of formatting this. Only because elements have a more general concept that they're just nodes. They're just this hierarchical nodes, right? That inverted tree where you have this root and you have all these branches going off, and we create these hierarchies by embedding elements inside of other elements. Okay. All right. So what else? Some of these elements have quite a bit of attributes that you can configure. Some of them there's so many that they start falling off the screen, right? So it makes it hard to read, right? So as a good practice would be to instead place every single attribute in its own line, right? As if it were an individual code, source code, right? Every single line. Yes? Makes it much easier to read for other folks. Remember, your code is not your own, right? You're working in a team, and it'll be very rare that you'll be working on your own. You'll typically be part of a larger team, and you're coding for the team. The team is going to look at your source code. Somebody else is going to have to be responsible for your code. Anything you can do to make it easier on them, the better, right? It increases the overall productivity of the team. Okay. So it's easier to read. And again, TAs will look for these things, right, in your source code. Right? Okay, let's see, what else? All right, we have that. A couple of things here. Notice that username and password are on the same line. Typically, it'd be nice if these would be in separate lines. So one of the things that we typically would do is to maybe provide a break here, a line break, and that would do the job. That would do that. It would break the line. Although it's a bad practice to misuse the BR. The break was not intended for this particular purpose, although it works just fine. It was more intended for breaking content for human purposes, like for instance, if you have an address, right? An address typically has a particular set of pieces, right? You have the street address, and you have the state, maybe the zip code, and then maybe down below you have the country. So it has a particular format that it has to look in a particular way. So the break lines were more for that kind of purpose, right? Here for adding vertical spacing, more commonly we use other things such as the divider, the div, right? The div adds the vertical spacing that you would normally not have. Right? So by default, the browser will render from left to right, from top to bottom, right? Only because we're in a Western culture. That's the way it went out, right? And when it has no more space on the right-hand side, it just loops, right? It just wraps around. Okay, that is the default behavior. Okay? So if you had no divs, right, this would just wrap, and when there's no more space, it just goes on to the next line. Okay, and that is the default behavior. So, but we can change that, and we'll change it as we go. So we have two divs here. We have this first div, and notice that the indentation. Please, again, indent all your content, again, to make it easier for others to read your code. So we have another div here. Oops. And break here. There we go. So we have a username, password, and login. Everybody okay? All right. All right. So we have the beginnings of what a login page might look like. Maybe let's break that up a little bit. Okay. The registration page might look very, very similar. Actually, let's create the registration page. We can where did it go? Project. There we go. We could just copy the login page and just sort of replace a couple things here, so we get the register page. That basically is the same content, but it might have a second password at the bottom. So let's copy that. So maybe we'll call it password 2. Okay, so validate. So this might be called validate password. So if we navigate there, we go register. We have the register page, so we'll call this register. And typically, you would allow folks to maybe navigate between these two, right? So if you're logging in on the login page, you might say, oh wait, no, I don't have a login, and you want to navigate to the register page, right? So we would use maybe an anchor for that, right? So we can go into login, and right next to the button, the login button, we might create an anchor that goes out to the register page. Oops. And might call this sign up. Sign up, is that one word, 2 words? So that if you're in the register page, in the login page, you click on login, it navigates to the register. Notice that this is the default behavior of the anchor, right? And we're going to do this default behavior this week up until next week when we introduce React, and then we will abandon this default behavior, and we'll jump to single page applications. A register, we might do the same thing. In the register, we might do a login, and this might be login. Login navigates back to login. Yes. All right, excellent. So we have those two. We might let's see. Let me see if we can start working on maybe on the. Yeah, let's work also on the user admin table. Let's take a look at that next.